I want to welcome our participants. I see people joining the meeting, and I wanted to tell you thank you for being here. My name is Elaine Kramer, and I'm a community planner with Pashik MTR, a local planning firm. And I'm here with Jim Pashik, our firm's founding partner, and my colleague, Heather Fuller, as well as Tess DeYoung from Connect, the Congress of Neighboring Communities here in Pittsburgh. And I am thrilled to welcome everybody to this webinar, and I'm going to share a screen for a second and start showing you all some stuff. So you should be able to see me and hear me and see an informational slide on the screen while everybody gets settled in. You can look over this and learn a little bit about the meeting. And once again, welcome. We're really glad you're here, and we appreciate your interest in Churchill Borough's future, in this planning and visioning project that we're embarking on, and especially for this participating in tonight's webinar, which we think is going to be really interesting. We'll be introducing the panelists in just a moment. Tonight's webinar is about the topic sense of place. So I want to begin by showing Churchill Borough's zoning map. Everybody see that okay? Panelists, can you give me some feedback?
Yep, looks good.
Okay. So we're here tonight because Churchill Borough decided to undertake a community planning and visioning project regarding the future of the borough's C1 commercial district. And that is this area right here in the light blue. In this map, R means residential and C means commercial. So many people may know of this as the former Westinghouse R&D site. And this visioning project has the purpose of asking residents what you would like to see happen at this site in the future. The visioning project is an outgrowth of Churchill's 10-year comprehensive plan. Back in 2016 and 17, Churchill, Monroeville, and Wilkins all began developing their 10-year, their long-term strategic plan, which in Pennsylvania is called a comprehensive plan. And that was adopted by all three communities in 2018. And then one recommendation from that plan was that Churchill would proactively plan for what could happen at this area, this large part of the community, which has had little use for many, many years now. So that comprehensive plan begat this visioning initiative that we're working on tonight. So I want to take just a minute to tell you how tonight's webinar fits into the whole planning and visioning project overall. There is a 6-part webinar series like the one that you're listening to now that has a panel discussion, and there will be a second one tonight after this, and then 4 more on subsequent, 2 per night on subsequent Wednesdays. And these discussions are designed to help all residents learn more about the possibilities of new development in the C1 district and to become engaged in the visioning process. Besides this, many of you may know that there is a questionnaire out for residents of the community that you can fill out. And if you want more information about that, you can go to churchillborough.com. Now, for tonight's meeting, I wanted to let you know a little bit more about this webinar. And so here's just a few logistics. This webinar is being recorded for later viewing, and all 6 webinars will be posted on via churchillborough.com. So you can, if you join this meeting late or have to leave it early or can't make all of the meetings, all 6, you can view them later. The agenda here shows how we'll divide up the time at each of the meetings. They'll all have this same time, general time frame. You will be able to submit questions for our panelists. And to do that, you can activate your toolbar, your Zoom toolbar, which looks like this, the black bar you see in the middle of the screen. And you can click on that Q&A and then type in your question, and we'll get to it, and then you have to hit submit or send or something. And then we'll collect those, and my colleague Heather is going to be monitoring those, and then we'll look for the ones that rise to the top, and we'll get to as many as we can, especially the ones that are posed by multiple people. We also wanted to mention that we've taken precautions to prevent Zoom bombing. You may have heard of this. It's inappropriate interruptions. In the unlikely event that something like that does happen, we will end the meeting immediately. So if you see something like that eyeball pop up on your screen, that means that we've made the decision to end the meeting. The hosts have made the decision to terminate the webinar. So we feel that that's very, very unlikely. We are actually expecting and looking forward to a really interesting webinar. So to get started, I wanted to show you two more maps to get everyone oriented. I don't know if everybody on this webinar is from Churchill, but whether you are or not, this might be interesting to you. What you can see on this map is Churchill Borough, surrounded by its communities, neighboring communities, Penn Hills, Wilkinsburg, Forest Hills, Wilkins, and then farther out, Pittsburgh and Monroeville. You can see some important features of the community. There's the Parkway, the Edgewood Country Clubs over here, the schools over here. The little yellow lines, which I hope you can see okay, are streets and roads, and then the white rectangles are building footprints. And so you can see the neighborhood context of the communities where, the neighborhoods in Churchill are labeled, and in the surrounding communities, you can see curvy streets and neighborhoods. And then over here is Road I Road. You have bigger white rectangles. That means that those are bigger buildings in more of a commercial area. We also wanted to point out this area that is outlined in purple is Churchill Borough's C1 district that we're talking about. Here's a blow up of that site, an aerial of it. Again, you can see the context with the surrounding roads. You can see, Greensburg over here. Lewin Lane is tree covered, but it's down there. Beulah, the Parkway. And it might interest you to know that when Westinghouse designed this site back in the 50s, they made it look like a locomotive engine because Westinghouse, of course there was Westinghouse Electric, but in addition, another branch of Westinghouse was a manufacturer of air brakes for locomotives. And so I just think that's interesting. The commercial district is made up of about just shy of 150 acres. The smaller is 13, the larger is 133 acres. Now I'd like to move on to panelist introduction.
We have someone who says they're a representative of the owner of the property and they would like to make a short statement. Is that possible? I don't think that's part of the agenda.
That is not part of the agenda. They'd certainly be welcome to submit questions via the Q&A. Absolutely. And we'll see if we can get to that. Jim, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, no, we'll just continue with this situation and invite them to make their statements before Borough Council.
Okay, thank you. Let's see, I'm going to stop screen sharing for a second because I want to I want to show you, just a sec. Or maybe I did, did I stop screen sharing, guys? Here. Okay, are we back to our group view? Okay, so I love the chance to, at this point, introduce our astonishing group of experts who have volunteered to be part of this, and I'm so grateful to you, and thank you very, very much for being part of this. Our panelists tonight are experts in sense of place and placemaking. They all specialize in this, but they come at it in different ways. And we're so honored that they volunteered to participate tonight. And I am absolutely delighted to introduce them, starting with Bill Callahan. Bill is the Western Pennsylvania Community Preservation Coordinator for the Pennsylvania State Historic Preservation Office. The Preservation Office is the bureau within the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission responsible for implementing state and federal historic preservation programs throughout the state. Bill has over 30 years experience working with historic preservation programs in Pennsylvania, Illinois, and Nebraska. He's worked in the private sector for several years, managing businesses in an historic downtown. And I should add that not only Bill's, but all of our panelists' bios are posted on churchillborough.com, so you can read even more about him and the others in that way. Kristen Hughes. Hi, Kristen. She's an associate professor at Carnegie Mellon University School of Design. Her research blends design with public health and placemaking. Specifically, it focuses on how collaborative, community-designed solutions can catalyze social and civic engagement, sort of like tonight's event. Her many community-based projects include Night Out Bakers, Latham Street Commons, and Fitwits. And these are examples of the successes that can happen when all members of the community collaborate on solving the vexing problems that communities face every day. So, you know, it's kind of perfect that she's here because, you know, this design problem is a question that she might introduce in her own class sometime. Kathy McCullum. Hi, Kathy.
Hi.
Has over 30 years of experience in community and economic development. She's the principal of McCullum Development Strategies, which specializes in community revitalization, business development, and tourism attraction initiatives for smaller and rural communities. She launched the first Trail Towns initiatives, and I lost my place, connect the communities along the Great Allegheny Passage with the economic impact of growing outdoor recreational market. So those are trail towns, but in addition to that, she's worked on the River Towns initiative. She directed that for the past 10 years. She's directed the River Towns program, which involves bringing dozens of communities bordering the Monongahela River in West Virginia and Pennsylvania along the Allegheny River in greater Pittsburgh area as well. And since the launch of the River Towns program in 2010, the program has leveraged over $20 million in infrastructure improvements, trails, visitor amenities, and business assistance. So River Towns and Trail Towns work with smaller communities, and I'd remind everybody that Churchill has 3,000 residents. It's a smaller community. Mike Moita. Hi, Mike. Mike is vice president and one of the principal architects at Design 3 Architecture located in Monroeville. Mike has been with D3A since 1983, where he oversees a wide range of commercial projects. He's a volunteer member of this Visioning Project Steering Committee. That's made up of 12 citizens, residents of Churchill. Mike has lived in Churchill for nearly 20 years and previously lived nearby in Wilkins, and that's where he grew up. He graduated from Churchill High School and received a Bachelor of Architecture degree from CMU. He's also a musician with the award-winning East Wind Symphonic Band. This, I think, is just a great, great lineup. So with that, I wondered if we could move into our panel discussion. How does that sound? Everybody ready to go?
Sure.
Okay. Okay. Well, thank you all once again. And I am going to start, if I could, with Kristen and Kathy. You guys ready? Each of you specializes in placemaking in different ways. Kathy, you help communities define their best attributes and pursue economic development strategies, that are based on those characteristics and features. And Kristen, you teach design, placemaking, and engaging with communities to help them envision how a new feature or asset should look. So I'd like to ask both of you, how would you define sense of place?
Christian, do you want me to start or would you like to?
You can kick it off.
Okay, happy to. Well, sense of place is really about the relationship between people and their spatial settings. It can be a very personal kind of, and often is a very personal kind of emotional response to those things that you see around you. It's what makes a community in your mind, or a town or a village, distinctive and a place you can care about. Usually it entails the architecture. Often historic architecture can evoke some feelings of sense of place. It's also about the setting. It can be hills and valleys and rivers and trees, or it can be downtown, center of a business district with tall, stately buildings. All of that contributes, as well as parks, open spaces, art, to your sense of place. So I always think of it in terms of take a walk in your mind through Zwickly and then walk on through Lawrenceville. Very different kinds of places. They speak to you in slightly different ways. Or perhaps you're walking down Grant Street in downtown Pittsburgh, for example. The buildings, the setbacks, how you react to the streetscape, the flowers, the smells, the sights, all of that give you a sense of place. It's what, in a usual sense, it's a positive experience. It can be negative if you're in a place that you don't feel perhaps safe or comfortable. But those places that you care most about, that evoke all the positive responses, those are the kind of distinctive places that you want to continue as you move forward in placemaking, so that you don't take away from your sense of personal place and yet add to it. So it's what offers you a sense of belonging to a particular place as well.
Place you care about, yeah. Kristen?
I was gonna say that's a beautiful definition, and just building off of that, when you're trying to understand what sense of place means to you and your community, is really trying to figure out how you first define what community is. So what is the Churchill community, and how do you begin to really think about its assets? So Kathy's mentioning things like architecture, but what about the history? What about the values of the community, the rituals of the community, the traditions of the community? All these things really start to help build into the identity, which then leads to the much larger, maybe more invisible system that you put in place that reinforces what sense of place is to you, not only as an individual, but in your group or in your sort of community. And that's kind of a wonderful thing when you get to that level of understanding of your community, that everyone feels included, they feel like their identity is represented, and they immediately get a sense of belonging. And oftentimes I think community planning fails because people don't define community first, and who their community is and what it's made up of.
Really good point. Thank you. Define community first. Mike, I have a question for you. You've lived in Churchill for almost 20 years, and as an architect, your work centers on creating places that are special for people in their own way, that have meaning for people who work there or live there. You do mostly commercial, but you've done all kinds of architecture and overseen that at your firm. So with your design and placemaking eye, can you tell us what key attributes does Churchill Borough have today that give it a sense of place, since you know the community probably better than any of us on this panel? And then the follow-up, the second part of that question is going to be, what are some of the elements or attributes or aspects of the community today that could or should propel it into the future, and what's missing?
Sure. Well, the key attributes, I would say that Churchill is predominantly well-maintained suburban residential 20th century single-family homes for the most part. And they're all primarily all accessed by cars as opposed to a walking neighborhood. And they're arranged and were developed organically, we say. They're separated by roadways and they're connected by the roadways, and several neighborhoods are created by that arrangement. And these neighborhoods are loosely identify themselves, I would say, as separate places. The types of homes, the types of landscaping has some continuity to them to create these different neighborhoods. I would say some missed opportunities would be the incorporation of sidewalks. There's other neighborhoods and other municipalities that have sidewalks that are a nice amenity, but I don't foresee that being able to be something that can be added. But some other, as far as looking to the future, to promote the vitality of the existing neighborhoods and help, continue that into the future, I would say that it would be nice to have some sort of commercial activity center that's nearby. It would probably have to be a public vehicular destination. But with businesses that, every day, although there's a new normal developing, it seems, but, businesses serving everyday needs, or retreats where, you might bump into your neighbors and stuff like that, as opposed to, a lot of people, unfortunately, drive into their garage, close the door, and they don't talk to enough people. So it would be nice, to have a place to go get a cup of coffee, maybe, I don't know, on your way to the dentist, or, some professional office, tax season, that type of thing, some sort of town center. So that type of amenity is kind of missing, and I think would help promote the vitality of the various neighborhoods in Churchill.
I think I hear you saying commercial and social space is something you feel is missing. Mm-hmm. Bill, may I turn to you now? You work for the Historical Museum Commission, and Historical and Museum Commission, and your job involves reviewing places or buildings for historical significance and preservation value. So our discussion here is future-oriented about Churchill's C1 district. This place was Westinghouse's main research and development campus for decades. It was a place of innovation, discovery, and industry, employing as many as 2,500 people at its height. While we're not asking you to do a preservation assessment of the Westinghouse R&D site, I wondered if you could talk in general terms about how places of significance in the past can hold or telegraph meaning over time. So is there an example from elsewhere or here to illustrate how the past can inform a future sense of place?
Sure. I think it's important to note that sense of place, and Kristen and Kathy did a marvelous job of defining kind of what that can look like, what it sounds like, how it's defined, and I think it's pretty obvious that in most places, the history of a place defines how it came to look the way it does, and how people associate and interact with it. The design of a place is the matrix within which human activities take place. And in terms of looking at how the past of a place can inform the future, if you think about how we pass time, how time passes. It's a combination of memory passing into anticipation. So we know how places looked and how they developed and how they interacted with us, and in order to kind of develop that maintain that sense of place that we care about and cherish in our homes, in our communities, we anticipate changes in a manner that would be beneficial to that past. So each place is unique. It's sometimes hard to point at one place and say, this is a good example of folks who thought ahead about anticipating how their place is going to change. But I can say it's critical to certainly to remember that people built these places and people live in them now. People, the activities that take place. We have to remember the people that occupy these places. A place like Churchill and the Westinghouse site has certainly meaning to the people in Churchill. But I think if we take a step back and look at a larger picture of the Pittsburgh region generally, it's one who historically, in the last couple of 100 years or last 150 years, has defined technological and industrial innovation, and Westinghouse was certainly part of that. It was an integral piece of that long history of technology and innovation that has defined this region and defined its physical character. And that looking to the future, that is also what's happening now in the region. We've gone from learning how to cook Coke to building robots and artificial intelligence. And the Westinghouse site and Churchill and the people in Churchill are a very distinct link in that chain of technological and industrial innovation. So I think keeping those things in mind is really important in terms of thinking of a design that we'd like Churchill to how we want things to look. When I think about places that have successfully done that, one of the closest examples I can think of is the South Side Works, where the former Jones and Laughlin steel plant was converted into a mixed-use development, very sensitive in terms of its design to the neighboring South Side flats, and both in terms of the commercial district and the Carson Street commercial district, and in terms of the residential construction that you see there. In terms of use, it's very compatible. I think it works very well in terms of that. Again, looking at the memory and anticipation of how we want things to change. It's a very different use than it had been historically, but it's sensitive to and compatible to the history of the area in which it now exists. And it also does a relatively good job of kind of trying to interpret some of that history and integrate outdoor recreation, some sort of level of natural resource conservation, and preservation in terms of preservation of the overall scale and feeling of the place. So that, in terms of being close, that's one of the best examples that I'm aware of.
That's so interesting. I've never heard that phrase, combining memory passing into anticipation.
I just made it up.
No, you didn't.
I did.
Oh my gosh. Wow. Amazing. So what are ways that, Bill, just continue, one more follow-up. What are ways that something like this could happen in Churchill? I mean, I'm not asking you to predict the future, but do you have anything to add about that?
I do, actually. Thank you for asking that question, because I do have, and thank you for the introduction, because I don't come to my job as a preservationist per se. That's not my background. My background is in business. But I came to learn in that there is actually money to be made in preservation, and a couple of things I want to note is that I'll say the best for last. The first part is that we've learned over time, and Kathy and I have actually presented about this on a number of occasions together, that the integration of natural resource conservation and outdoor recreation and preservation has been shown through any number of national, statewide, and regional surveys. It's kind of what people want out of their communities. They want their communities to maintain a sense of place. They want access to outdoor recreation, and they want, as much as possible, to preserve natural resources within the areas that they reside. So I think Mike's comments, I think, are right on point in terms of how people react to places. The other thing, and here's the good part, especially for I'm hoping the property owners are on here, because as you mentioned that I'm not here, and I can't make an assessment of the site. However, it's Westinghouse. So the significance is certainly there. This site has never been evaluated by my office, but we are in a place now where the buildings are of an age when I think the property owners need to seriously consider getting an assessment of the historic significance of the site, because since these would be presumably income-producing places, there are federal and state rehabilitation investment tax credits that could go towards the adaptive reuse of these buildings, if that's within the realm of the development potential there. And these credits for a site of this scale could add up to tens of millions of dollars worth of tax incentive. Should the property be considered historic for the purposes of the tax credit program. So I think that's something, there's no downside to getting an assessment done to determining whether or not the property is eligible for the National Register of Places, which is the definition that we use. It doesn't obligate the property owner can do anything they want with the property. It doesn't obligate the property owner in any way. There's no catch to it. There's no requirement that they treat it in a special way. But it does give them an opportunity to make decisions about financing and approach, knowing whether or not the property is a good candidate for the National Register. Because if it is, there's an enormous amount of money that could be put into the incentive, the financing side of things, based on that eligibility determination.
That's really interesting. And I want to telegraph just for a second to the people, our webinar audience members and participants, that we want this series to be very realistic. And the last one, we thought would be really important to have a very realistic look at the realities of market conditions. Excuse me. So our last webinar in the series will touch on that. We'll focus entirely on that. So I don't know, this is kind of for everybody, but whoever wants to answer it. Churchill's sense of itself, its own sense of place, for decades was tied to the Westinghouse R&D site. A retiree told me that when he wears his badge, his Westinghouse, or not a retiree, a current employee says that when he wears his badge and he goes out in the community, he's stopped by people all the time who say, oh, I worked there, and they want to tell their stories about what it was like over the years. The campus was the defining element of the borough for quite a while. A lot of the houses grew up to provide residences for the people who worked there. Home values had stable growth because of the value of that corporate campus. Now the site has been underused for decades, and something new will happen there at some point. And how could a new use at the site contribute to Churchill's future sense of itself? And what are some uses or types of redevelopment that would build on or enhance Churchill's current or future sense of itself? And this can build on what Mike said in his opening when he answered a question for me. Anybody?
Yeah, well, reflecting on that, having lived around here for almost all my life, and I've only had a few opportunities to be within the property, but I kind of liken that property to be a bit like a terrarium that everyone in the surrounding communities looks into and appreciates. There's lovely landscaping on a macro level, even though there's some even more special landscaping within, but no one knows about that for the most part. But it's something that is, as you drive by, it's nice to look into and wonder what's going on in there, and in terms of even research and development, let alone the wildlife and the deer and everything. And I think everyone would hope to that it's always going to be something interesting to look into. It's always going to be a separate place, whatever it is, be it any kind of use, because it has limited access points for vehicles, and certainly pedestrians would be some serious walkers if they're really walking far. But as in contrast to what Bill was talking about at the Southside Works, the design there was able to meld into the neighboring district and flow into. This is going to I imagine it to be always a separate place of some sorts, and hopefully Churchill will continue to the community will identify with it, whatever it is.
Thank you. Kathy?
Elaine, excuse me, before you start with the next question, the borough has asked that we make it very clear that I made a mistake at the beginning of the meeting. And at the question and answer period that we have from residents and attendees, that we'd like to allow 3 minutes for the owner to speak. And Tess has identified the owner and knows when to click the unmute button at the appropriate time. So I just wanted to make it very clear that I was incorrect, and we will provide that opportunity. And as I mentioned in a communication to the owner, we certainly are welcome to provide even more than the 3 minutes, either through a video or through written material to be included with the record of this meeting. So we just have a very tight schedule to keep going with. So my apologies for misspeaking, and at about 6:25, we'll ask Ms. O'Neill to speak for 3 minutes.
Thanks for clarifying, Jim, and I had it wrong too then. Thank you. I think Kathy was going to say something.
Yeah, in a way, it's a bit of a question, building off of what Mike was talking about. Is the site going to be difficult from a physical standpoint to integrate into the community? Because it looks from the mapping and from driving by to be quite a lovely, extensive space, multiple, many acres. And it would be a wonderful community asset if somehow it could incorporate walking trails or access for people to socialize in a green space. From what little I know of Churchill, and I plan to visit it shortly, but there seems to be an emphasis on what greenery is already available in Churchill, and you're building on more green spaces and integrating outdoor kinds of experiences. With that much acreage, I would hope there would be a way to look at integrating any use of that space with public access and ability to walk and enjoy the outdoor space. So it's a general question. If the terrain does not allow for it, then of course that will make the whole situation a little more difficult. But it seems very important to me that any development on that space be integrated into the sense of place that exists in Churchill.
Yes, the site, I've been told, has up to 200 different species of trees. Originally, it was designed during the Westinghouse's heyday to have a pond, which is still there. You can see it from the highway ramp. That was for firefighting, but it's a pond that you can see waterfowl on the pond. You know, and then I think too there were At one point, there was a 9-hole golf course on it that executives use. So, it does have terrain and vistas, and the access certainly is limited. And I know I almost always drive off the highway when I go past trying to look in.
Well, and one other final point to that issue is any large-scale employer will likely find that their employees will want to be outside making use of such beautiful surrounding with walking paths or places to socialize or the ability to, get out of a building into the area that surrounds it.
Really good
Now,
point.
we need
Kristen,
attractive access.
I think Kristen was going to answer too.
I think one of the nice things about what you're doing is that this is an opportunity for the community to really identify, what they think is missing. Oftentimes we think about things we think we need, but then when you start looking around you and you realize there are a lot of economic opportunities, environmental opportunities, social opportunities that are missing in a community. And so what could a place like this do? How do we begin to build bridges to the surrounding communities so that everyone feels like this is a place that everyone belongs and feels included in? And, I think that's where, off of Bill's point, it gets really interesting to think about what is the next workforce development? What are some of the issues surrounding public health and community health that, we're at a really neat opportunity, I think, as a society to begin to rethink sort of conventional systems that we have in place and reshape them and reimagine sort of the future. And that's the kind of the power that you're putting in the hands of the community, is to really think about that next generation and what the future needs. And oftentimes history can help inform that, but often it's this community process that can really push forward something that is relatively new and innovative.
I like the words you used, a place where everyone feels they belong, a democratized space. And to build on that, actually, Kristen, I wanted to ask you, if you don't mind continuing, when you do, you're with students all the time, and when you do community engagement regarding design places, have you seen trends or priorities that newer generations are looking for, such as millennial or Gen X populations? So I'm a baby boomer, and so for me, functionality and practicality is really important. But what are other people's priorities, especially for a community that hopes to attract newer generations to be, to move in and stay?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. It's a lot is spending time asking them. I think I can add to the point of just saying it's really multi-generational. So even though the young to use some co-working space or maybe some sort of shared housing, the older generation is often the ones that are volunteering, going to the parks and weeding, making sure the trails are clean. And I think figuring out ways that we can inspire and motivate the younger generation to come in to feel that there is a civic duty and responsibility towards community. Community is a really hard thing to build. And so this consensus process is really, really critical. And how you do that is really, today's the first step, right? Is trying to understand the best way to engage with people. How do people feel included? Are all the stakeholders here in this webinar? Do you have to start going door to door and really making sure that if someone wanted their voice to be heard, it was heard. And that's a really important thing. But I think for the younger generation and, looking at a lot of trends where they're not buying cars, they're not buying houses, they are changing their jobs an awful lot, that makes it a really big challenge when we start asking questions about future of community. And so who is the future of community and what does that mean?
Oh, that's kind of cosmic. Wow, that's great.
I think if I can kind of build a little bit on what Chris, she's exactly right. I mean, and I think one of the interesting things that we found in the circle that I work in is that there are some common desires on the part of some of the older generation, some of the retiring baby boomers, and the younger generation who are just starting to well, who have now the millennial generation been in the workforce now for 10 or so years, and they're still kind of entering into that. There are some commonalities in some of the things they're looking for in community. Not everybody. I mean, you can't make that kind of generalization. But one of the commonalities in some cases tend to be this kind of authentic place, place where people want to live, the authenticity of the place, access to outdoor activities, access to technology, access to transportation. And a place like Churchill, with the right kind of market assessment and the right kind of then follow-up marketing, and as Kristen said, ask people what they want and then provide it for them. Since Churchill has this established and fairly well-known kind of built environment, how do we make that environment appeal to a certain group of folks who want to, invest in the community, both in terms of investment, and I'm not talking just about, I'm talking about, financial investment, but I'm also talking about investment of themselves, investment of their presence and their activities and what they do. And as I think it's been an interesting phenomenon to kind of see this overlap. These for very different reasons, these different generations to some extent wanting kind of the same thing out of the places they live.
Do you mind if I piggyback on that, Bill, by asking you if you've seen other large redevelopment sites where, creating a sense of place was critical to the site's future success in some of the ways you were talking about, building the community and the commonality and growing off of what, citizens envision?
Yeah, I think a lot of capital M, capital S Main Street places have successfully pulled that off. I think if you want to look just very close to where we are, if you look at places like Millvale and Etna and Sharpsburg, they're appealing to a cross-generational demographic of folks who are interested in the community. If you look at some of the elected officials, they in some of these communities, they run the gamut from who could be my children to people who could be my parents, and they're working together to make really, I think I use those three communities as examples of places where the uses and the demographics of the places are changing significantly, and they're seeing different kinds of pressures, but they're working together to use the sense of place, use the place where they live in a kind of a nimble way to provide opportunities for both younger and older generations.
The multi-generational approach. That's
really
something for everybody. Mike, can I jump to you to sort of bring this point that we were just discussing back to Churchill and the potential future development there. I'm wondering, what can architecture do to strengthen a sense of place? We don't know what future development will occur at the C1 district. So as an architect, could you help residents imagine potential different uses, future uses? And I'm just throwing these out there: manufacturing, research labs, mixed use, residential, warehouse. What can architecture do to strengthen the sense of place in different scenarios?
Sure. Well, all those different types of uses, buildings have different qualities that they need to have to support the function, but a sense of place can be created by the arrangement of buildings that have some common attributes, as opposed to everyone looking a little bit different. But just even things like the mass and the proportions, the style, surfaces, the spacing, not all of them, but just enough of commonalities start to create a sense of place. And that would be an outdoor space. Of course, within each of these buildings, there's places as well, but I believe we're mostly talking about outdoor places. And a sense of place is usually something that's unique, as opposed to, like, anywhere USA. Sometimes, some of our commercial districts kind of look like you could go to any town in the country, and you're not quite sure where you're at if you were led there blindfolded. So some sort of uniqueness usually is involved with a sense of place, which obviously can be supported by the architecture and the landscaping. Landscaping and hardscapes, they enhance the architecture and the sense of place, and they can create sub places within places. So the more cohesive these qualities are in form and function, the stronger the sense of place. Sometimes a sense of place could also be just created by a singular structure or a mass of buildings that create a focus and are that are a distance and from everything else. And this is sort of like that. It's defined by all these roadways around that, and or even other places like Monroeville Mall. It's a collection of buildings and surrounded by a parking lot. But that's a place that people can identify with as well, just by its size and unique arrangement. So yeah, architecture is very involved with the sense of place.
To create that cohesion in both form and to link it to the functionality of the space and movement in and around and within the space.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Kathy, let me turn to you again.
Right.
What unique qualities or characteristics provide a meaning to a community? So like Churchill, it's a small community as you're accustomed to working in. So what unique characteristics or qualities provide a meaning to Churchill or to a large redevelopment site like this in the C1 district? Mike had just spoken about cohesion of form and function, and then you translate that kind of stuff into economic development and community development.
Well, asking me to speak about what would work for Churchill, it would not be the right approach from my standpoint. Obviously you're talking to folks, or they're on the line listening, and that decision will come from them. It's their place, it's their sense of caring, and it's their history with Churchill that will move forward on any decisions made. What I hope happens, and what appears to be true, is that as the planning and discussion continues, that everybody who can get involved will get involved in talking about that, those aspects of Churchill that they care about, that they want to see continue integrated into any use for this C1 area. And, it can be, as simple as programming activities that involve and connect the new developments to the existing aspects of Churchill that are still important to the folks that live and continue to invest in Churchill. So they will make, the people of Churchill will make the decisions, I think, but I hope that they continue to speak loudly about those aspects that they want to see that remain as part of their home and their existing sense of place.
What a great comment. I've just appreciated what everybody had to say, and bringing it back to putting it in the hands of citizens to have a voice. And that's exactly why we're here tonight. And we're going to be back to the panel for more of your opinions, but I think it's time now to...
Yeah, Elaine, if I could just mention that we're now going into that 15 minutes of Q&A that we have set aside, and we've gotten some really, really interesting questions that we'll be sharing with the panelists. There'll be some challenging questions too, so they'll be on your best game for that. But before we start that, I had promised Ms. O'Neill, who represents the owner of the property, 3 minutes at the beginning of the Q&A to make a statement. And I've also promised that if, although we are limited to 3 minutes right now, any additional statement or any written statement would be added and made part of this record, so that we're not feeling like we're excluding someone, but we have a very tight schedule. We have another webinar that starts 15 minutes after this one. So Tess, if you could unmute Ms. O'Neill, maybe we could ask her to speak as she would like to.
Thank you. Are you able to hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Good evening. My name is Rachel O'Neill. I'm an attorney with Reed Smith, and we represent Churchill Crossing Partners LP. As you should be aware, Churchill Crossings owns the former Westinghouse campus located at 1310 Beulah Road being discussed tonight. And as such, Churchill Crossings is both the property owner and a taxpayer in this borough. Churchill Crossings invested a significant amount of money into this property, and the Westinghouse campus is the only property identified in the promotional materials as the subject matter for this visioning workshop process. Despite targeting our client's property, the borough did not mail or otherwise transmit the public notices for the visioning workshop to our client and failed to previously engage Churchill Crossings in any meaningful way regarding this workshop process. The borough's failures occurred even though our client has always been transparent with the borough. Churchill Crossings was not consulted in the selection of the workshop presenters, nor did the client have input in the format of the promotional survey that you may have received. In fact, Churchill Crossings representative was even excluded from attending an informal kickoff meeting that the borough expressly advertised was open to the public. We want you to understand that this process appears to be designed to reach a predetermined result that is adverse to our client. Reed Smith already sent a formal cease and desist letter to the borough objecting to this process and the lack of prior consultation about this process with the client. Nevertheless, the borough persists in commencing a clearly flawed process targeting a single property to the detriment of our client. Our client, the property owner, objects to this process and the effort of this borough to support a visioning process for the Westinghouse campus, especially when the property is already under agreement with a proposed purchaser who has transparently communicated with the borough its substantial plans for the property. Indeed, officials at the borough have had substantial communications with the proposed purchaser and at the same time are proceeding without a fundamentally fair and reasoned visioning process that includes full and meaningful participation with the owner after a serious dialogue on the nature and scope of the visioning workshop. We note as well that the borough's visioning process was not clearly advertised in the context of developing an overall comprehensive plan for the borough, but rather this process explicitly targets a single privately owned property. We again ask this borough to do the right thing and stop this process and start working with our client, the taxpayer, instead of against it. I ask that this statement of the Churchill Crossings be made part of the record and Churchill Crossings objections be duly noted by this committee should the committee persist in proceeding against the interests of our client. Churchill Crossings is the owner and the taxpayer of the Westinghouse campus, and we respectfully request that these visioning workshops cease. Thank you for allowing me to make that statement, and thank you for your time. I understand that we're on a tight schedule tonight, and I appreciate it.
Thank you very much. So Heather, I believe you have some questions from attendees.
Yes. One person has stated, Churchill was built on the idea of suburban living, a sleeper community. There is no main street as a result. Sense of place is both an idea of the community at large and here found on a micro street level. Does the commercial space need to be connected to the community, or in sleeper communities is the sense of place found elsewhere like parks or community centers?
Tess, you may need to open up a few mics there for responses. Who'd like to answer? Oh, Kathy looks like she's
Needed.
Well, as I had said before, there's a collection of neighborhoods connected by roadways and separated by roadways and topography. And yes, um, uh, these neighborhoods have their own sense of place, and others places that they like to or need to go to could be anywhere. It's a matter of how far you feel like driving. So I think we're just kind of discussing what would what would be nice to have happen at this one place in our backyard.
Who else?
I think in instant it seemed to lost Kathy, but I'll go back maybe and refer to something Kathy said. You know, the sense of a place is dependent upon the people who live there. The sense of place is not imposed by any specific process or organization or anything else. It is a collective decision by the folks who live there and to some extent the folks in the surrounding communities. So is Churchill a suburban community? Of course it is. Is this site part of that long history and sense of place? Sure, seems to me. But how that then moves forward, I think, it's completely up to the community.
Kathy.
Oh, I'm still here. I just couldn't add anything more perfectly already stated by Bill and Mike. I think I totally agree. The sense of place does not have predetermined, this much commercial, this much residential. It varies depending on, the community. I live in a very rural area surrounded by mountains and rivers and lots of trees, very few commercial buildings, and that's our sense of place. So you don't need one particular aspect of a community. It's very much dependent on the people who live there. They determine the character.
Thank you. Heather, do we have another question?
Can the C1 area be rezoned to something less developed, like a park?
I'm not sure from a sense of place perspective that we can answer that right now, but it's a great question that we'll save for some of the other panels in the next couple weeks, because then I think we might want to talk about that. But at this point, we're not talking about rezoning as much as trying to understand how these two parcels in the C1 district fit into the community. So we'll save that question.
And that is it for now. I think some more people are submitting questions, but I think you all had some more questions as well.
Go ahead, Elaine.
Oh yeah, we have more. Let's see, I'd like to ask the group this. Can a region have a sense of place? So for example, the first map I showed, second map I showed Churchill within its surrounding communities, but then if you picture Allegheny County, Churchill is a part of eastern Allegheny County, and it's more of a region. So I wondered if a region can have a sense of place. Does this part of the county have a sense of place, and could redevelopment in the C1 district help provide that identity or definition? And my question is, can you give us an example from elsewhere if it is true that a region can have a sense of place?
I think regions most definitely have senses of place. I mean, think of how each of us would feel or how you would react if someone said the North Hills, for example. Now the North Hills is a multitude of different municipalities, but the overarching thought process or your reaction evokes feelings about the North Hills, even if you have just basically driven to and from it, and that's a region. I think the same applies with the East End of Pittsburgh, or the South Side. Bill alluded to South Side Works as a bookend to the South Side, and then Station Square with, you know, a myriad of very different kinds of activities in between. And that's regional, I think, not just a single community. So I would say that definitely you can have a region.
And Kristen?
I was gonna say, I moved here from Boston 18 years ago. And, you know, when I came from a place like Boston to a place like Pittsburgh, I never realized how important sense of place was. And, you know, it took me 5 years to really love Pittsburgh's sense of place and sort of this Rust Belt region and all that it stands for. But, you know, you realize how important these regional assets are that tell such an incredible history and, you know, this sort of sense of belonging to place. So, you know, I consider myself now a Pittsburgher, and quickly loved the Steelers. But, you know, all these things define a place, and that's such a wonderful thing about Pittsburgh, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And can a site like this C1 area, 150 acres, have an effect on a regional sense of place? Can anybody think of an example from elsewhere where it either has or really hasn't?
I think I would look at that question from the other direction, because we really are talking about you know, the sense of place. If we're talking about a regional sense of place, I think I came here from the Midwest 15 years ago, and I think there's really no question. It's unquestionable that there's a sense of place that's established by the area where we all live and Churchill's part of. I think it's, well, frankly, I'll say it, I think it's a mistake to think about an individual place as being its own siloed entity. I think any kind of planning, any kind of economic development strategy has to consider in the 21st century, really has to think about broader regional aspects, both in terms of market, in terms of the places, the way it physically fits into the region. Can a place like this add to that regional sense of place? Of course, sure, absolutely. Can it subtract from that regional sense of place? Sure. But I think it's important to think about these things in a much broader perspective, because that's the world we live in now. We live in a world where this kind of regional, multi-municipal and multi in terms of economic development strategies, we have to connect with other places and other strategies to be successful. That's just the way the world works now.
So everything has to be within the context, and the context is what matters. Let's see. I wondered what other lessons we can learn from other communities, either in our area or elsewhere. A lot of us moved Pittsburgh by choice, that can give us, what other lessons can we learn regarding creating or capitalizing on a sense of place? You know, there must be examples from far and wide.
If I can launch into a close-in example, and it's the multiple communities along the Monongahela River outside of Pittsburgh, outside of Allegheny County. I think what they learned, these small, very small communities learned early on, that working together gave them a much larger voice and offered the ability to impact what happened in their region a little more significantly. If you are a single, small, isolated community, and we have many, many municipalities in the Commonwealth, your voice will not be loud enough to make a discernible difference if you want to make real change in your area. So in the case of the very distressed communities along the Monongahela River working together allowed them to have a much louder voice, and then they could work toward an improved regional kind of quality of life, rather than thinking only of a small community getting ahead of their neighbor. So it took a while, but they, I think, are thinking now in terms of we're part of a much greater whole, because visitors don't recognize when one borough ends and another begins. And that's important to remember in any sort of community planning of a large scale development, I think.
Yeah, and Kathy, just building on that, you know, everyone wants things to happen really fast, and these community planning processes are actually very slow, and you have to kind of walk slowly to get someplace together. And, you know, oftentimes lack of transparency or lack of communication or miscommunication, as we just saw, can be, you know, a major stumbling block in some of these planning processes. And that's a really important thing, is to acknowledge, you know, again, that everyone feels like they're included and listened to and somehow responded to in a way that makes them feel like their opinion matters. It's a really important part of it.
Thank you, Kristen. I wanted to shift us to the next segment of the webinar, which is with we call the lightning round. I think that's a fun term. But what we'd like to do is have the panelists share with us a few key words or phrase that captures some of the things we've been talking about tonight. And we'd like, Heather from our office is going to try to use a whiteboard and record those, so you may need to speak slowly or give an idea and then figure out what few words would represent that idea. And so, Kristen, I'm going to pick on you as the first one.
Okay.
But I wondered if you could just, and we're going to go around a number of times, so you don't have to give me all of them. Just one idea that captures this sense of place topic that we've been working on, and something that we should be thinking about as we begin to develop a vision for Churchill.
Okay. How about build a common language and understanding of each other's differences?
Build a common language and understand each other's differences. That comes the base for some of that sense of place. Kathy.
This isn't my phraseology, I'm borrowing it, but I love it in particular when it comes to a sense of place, and that's heart and soul planning.
Nice. Nice.
SOUL.
Yeah, we don't want the shoe sole.
Could be that,
Almost.
I guess.
Give her a hard time.
What does that mean? What does heart and soul planning mean?
To me, it's always meant, much of what we've talked about this evening, people listening to one another and speaking from their hearts, talking about what the place means to them, why it's important to continue that which has value within their community, and to keep expanding on that. Change isn't necessarily bad, but we have to, I think a community has to be cognizant that planning new development means opening up their hearts and their minds to listening to others and new ideas. While again, retaining the character of that which they love, which is their town.
Great, thank you, Kathy. Bill, give us a couple words or a phrase.
If we were doing this traditionally, like in a room together, I'd ask if I could put a green dot on Kristen's statement, a sticky. But I would, I think, and I've actually kind of gotten enamored of this myself. I think in terms of a sense of place, thinking about memory leading to anticipation, leading to action. Yeah, I think I like action better than anticipation, actually.
Thank you, Bill. Mike, give us a couple words related to sense of place that are important.
Okay,
Mike.
how about, yeah, I'm here, I had to unmute. Okay, how about cohesive attributes for a unique experience?
I'm so glad I'm not typing.
Yeah, me too.
Heather, thank you.
Thanks.
No pressure.
Mike, what do you mean by that?
Did we lose Mike?
I
No,
don't know.
I'm still here. What?
What do you mean by that? Can you explain a little bit?
Well, you know, I was walking along a trail through the woods, and everything was pretty much the same that I've been seeing for the past 20 minutes, 30 minutes. All of a sudden, I came into a part of the woods where someone had planted nothing but birch trees. It was just birch trees as far as you could see. And that was unique. And it was like, wow, look at this. And that was a unique experience. And amongst all this same old woods stuff, I found a sense of place.
Nice, thank you, Ma. So we're back to Kristen. Add another one, Kristen.
Okay. Something that I always say to my student is reveal the really special hidden details of a community story. And sometimes that takes a lot of time to look for the history or find the special people that remember things, but that's a lot that goes into, I think, placemaking.
Nice, thank you very much. Kathy, another one.
Maintain your distinctiveness, because the more a community looks and feels like every other community, I think one of the panelists pointed this out earlier, the less reason there'll be to live or invest in that community. So maintain your distinctiveness.
Good one.
Nice, thank you. Bill. Do we have Bill online?
He's on mute.
I muted myself. Think cohesively. Consider all aspects of community and economic development.
Great, thank you. Mike, we're back to you.
Oh boy, there's so many good things here already. I'm at a loss.
No worries, we'll move right on. That's easy.
Okay.
We'll give Kristen one more try.
Okay, I'm going to add, if the connections aren't there, reconnect people so that new opportunities for learning and innovation can happen. So really this whole idea of cross-generational, multi-generational learning and doing.
What kind of connections do you mean by that? Like, are you talking about meetings or,
Meetings, happenings at the ice cream shop, at the coffee shop, but understanding that multi-generational voices really matter to a place. It's not about the millennials. It's not about the people that are retiring out of a place. It's how all of these people come together. And I think Bill's example of Millvale and Etna, groups like New Sun Rising, using the eco districts framework have just done such a wonderful job with this kind of multi-generational kind of value system. It's a really wonderful thing to see and kind of witness over time, where you really learn how to respect and value other people's opinions and behaviors. It's a really nice thing, and they've worked very hard at it.
Terrific, thank you. And Kathy, one more time.
One more time. Engage as many people as possible. And I think that builds on what Kristen was just talking about.
Wonderful. And
Kathy,
Bill, your last comment, do you have anything to add to the list?
Yeah, work from a foundation of knowledge, collect data. Let's find out what we can do here. What's possible.
Can I just add one more thing here?
Please do.
Is make sure that you're listening really carefully to your natural system. So nature just speaks so much louder than we actually give it time for. And there's just sounds like that's a really important part of this place, and these natural systems are probably already telling you a lot about the place.
And I want to just pick up on something that Bill said, work from foundation of knowledge, what is possible. And that's sort of the purpose of this, this webinar and the other webinars that we'll be hosting again later, at 7:15 tonight and then in the coming weeks. I think that helps the community understand some of the, possibilities that are out there because of the expertise that you panelists have provided.
You caught me out, Elaine. I was biting our tail.
All righty. If I may, I'd like to, is there anything that we should add to the list before we move on?
I want to reiterate once again, because this is something that we end up in the State Preservation Office talk about all the time. I'd like to reiterate. I hope the owner's representative is still on the phone on whatever we call this. I think in terms of any kind of planning for their property, it would behoove them to have an assessment of the property made for its eligibility for the National Register, because if they don't, I can't guarantee this at all, of course, because if they don't, they might be leaving a significant amount of money on the table.
Great, thank you, Bill. That's why we bring experts like you to the panel. Thank you very much. So I'd like to do some closing remarks. They're going to be very brief, so don't worry. But I happened to jot down a few things that I was hearing that have been captured on the list. We're talking about a sense of place tonight, and that's a place of belonging. I heard that in different ways. I heard authenticity of place. I love that term. Where people want to live. How do we make Churchill desirable to invest in? That architecture can create a sense of place. And I absolutely love this. It was Kathy that said, or no, maybe it was Kristen that said, walk slowly to get together. I love that. That's a wonderful description of process. I'd like to thank the panelists very much for being part of this. You guys are amazing. So you did a wonderful job. I'd like to thank the attendees. We had as many as 51 attendees, participants at the time. So that's a great response. So thank you for taking the time. This panel discussion has been recorded and will be available along with the whiteboard suggestions. There were some questions we didn't get to. I apologize for that, but we had a lot of questions, and unfortunately, in order to make sure it didn't get too long, a very prescribed period of time to work in. So I apologize for any questions we didn't get to. Some of them we might be able to get to in subsequent panel discussions. We do hope that you will join us for the next panel discussion, which will happen at 7:15. West for the weary, Elaine. And don't forget to plan on joining us for some of the other panels besides the one on connectivity at 7:15. On May 6th at 5:30, we'll be talking about living infrastructure and resource conservation. That same evening at 7:15, we'll talk about human well-being. It's got some really great panelists on that. On May 13th at 5:30, we'll be talking about design standards and forms. And we'll close out at 7:15 on May 13th with some talk about what the market, how that market impacts what can happen in the C1 district. So thank you so much for being with us, both the panelists and the attendees. And I look forward to talking to you more about these things as we move ahead with Churchill. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.